two lenses better than one? In past travel videos, I only had the endurance to bring one camera and one lens. The 28 and 35mm have always been my favorite, but sometimes in order to grow, you have to push outside of your comfort zone. I don't have a zoom, but I do have two lenses, so on my trip to Tianjin, I brought the Zeiss Otus 55 and 28mm, and this is what I have to share. They say all lens design is compromise, and so is focal length. I've always considered 28mm full frame to be the ideal focal length for travel. Camera shake is foremost less noticeable, which facilitates smoother handheld when exploring a new city. Although you can use ultra-wides to convey distortion and paranoia, there is generally a spacious freedom associated with standard wides that makes a shot look beautiful. The lack of compression on a 28mm makes it perfect for establishing shots, neutrally reproducing cityscapes at the cost of less magnetic headshots. This is not to say wides cannot do close-ups, as directors like Wong Kar-wai are renowned for filming inches away from an actor's face. My perception of intimacy involves a tangible proximity between camera and subject, and the minimum close focusing distance of wider optics physically allows you to get closer. This immersion is a different intimacy than the closeness of a long lens, with its compression magnifying proximity instead. Perspective distortion is possible even for rectilinear 28mm, and so you have to pay attention to camera angles. Objects on the outskirts of the frame can appear bigger when nearing the lens, which can make for some interesting body dysmorphia. Leading lines are also more pronounced on wides, often converging toward the center. But what I haven't really heard anyone discuss is selecting aperture on Zeiss lenses. Zeiss lenses essentially have two aperture ranges, one with 3D pop and one with optical perfection. At 5.6, Zeiss lenses give way to perfect corners, but the 3D rendering flattens out, losing its distinction over stills glass. So if you want pop from your Zeiss lenses, f4 is the limit. Before you blindly take anyone's recommendations, including mine on f-stop, realize that distance plays just as big of a role in bokeh. Even wide open at f1.4, you'll still have depth of field on a 28mm if your subject is near the same plane as their background. Even if there is significant subject separation, you might still find the majority of the scene to be in focus if you're shooting at a far enough distance, which is often the case with wides. You can always get plenty of blur on a wide lens no matter the aperture. Just take a few steps closer. It always seemed counterintuitive to bring a medium lens traveling because handheld will look shakier on longer lenses. The 55mm has spiritually been a tripod lens for me, but I was surprised to find this time around that it works for run and gun when you have the right movement. A notable observation I've found in making these standard lenses work is the camera angle. Longer lenses make everything look bigger, so you'll typically want to film people from the side or at different vantage points. If you're going for a beauty shot, I would strongly recommend not shooting head-on with these longer lenses, which make the face look overly round. If it can't be helped, then at least guide the subject to slightly turn their head to the side. I personally find that these medium shots are not as dynamic when positioned perpendicular to the background. This is a consequence of lens compression, which collapses the background and foreground, making them appear closer than in real life. By distorting relative sizes of objects, compression makes distance flatter, but also evokes a surrealist impression with the scene looking smaller. For this reason, I don't really like implementing shallow depth of field on compressed lenses, which begin to resemble photoshopped backgrounds. Distance exaggerates this bokeh, making the f-stop on a 55 look 1 or 2 stops less than on a 28. Sometimes I might even feel 5.6 is too blurry. If you are so inclined to shoot wide open, then I would suggest incorporating more planes of field in the shot to have more contextual separation so it's not simply a blurry mess. Maybe if you are shooting a close-up with bokeh balls decorating the night, it can look nice. But for a frame with more than half a body, you need to start considering the risk of Photoshop bokeh. Photographers might love this look anyway, as demonstrated by the popularity of nifty 50s, which can easily capture magnetic imagery when its compression can generate such strong focus. Although the Otus 55 is my most aesthetically impressive lens, the overpowering compression displaces you in an immersive way that you can't confidently gauge how far away you are from the subject. My thought process for bringing out a lens like this is for two scenarios: when I want a close-up or to squash a location. You can make the world feel smaller with a compressed lens, which is fantastic to exaggerate a moment. But if everything is exaggerated, then what actually stands out? If you gravitate towards a certain focal length, why even bother switching? You can certainly film an entire project using one lens, but expanding new focal lengths to your vocabulary allows for engaging perspective shifts in your storytelling. The conventional travel experience typically starts out wide, then longer when honing in on the minutiae, and finally widening out again for a final expansion. But I think it's more absorbing to start a story with a macro element instead. Shooting disjointed coverage is also a fantastic reason to swap focal lengths. I particularly find linking continuous movement from stable or long shots to wide and handheld makes for a smooth cinematic transition. Just remember that your job as a camera operator should strive to be as invisible as possible, minimizing distracting cuts and jarring focal lengths so viewers can better immerse themselves into the story. To maintain such continuity, take into account compression and bokeh characteristics when swapping lenses. It's common practice to retain the same t-stop among a set of lenses for a scene, as lighting usually stays consistent. But hopefully you can identify the bokeh incongruity in this video and avoid the mistakes I made by keeping the same aperture on the 28 and 55. I'd consider slightly stopping down every time you switch to a compressed lens if you want depth of field to stay consistent. For narrative work, I believe there should be a primary lens equating to the main perspective of the protagonist. Secondary lenses shouldn't be sprinkled in just because you feel they aren't getting their value or want to spice things up. They should be employed only to communicate when a shot is important or requires greater detail. When there's no rhyme or reason for switching lenses other than accommodating the size of the room, the story subconsciously loses its logical structure. We motivate lighting, characters, color grading, and everything else in storytelling. Why shouldn't we do the same for focal length? Visual diversification quickly devolves into an unholy recipe when building cinematic contrast. It's restraint that provides gravitas in a dynamic narrative. If you feel the color choices of this video also have the right amount of nuance, I simply added a CleverLUT after a basic film emulation, which are designed to be applied after a finished grade and can even stack on top of each other. They're versatile, work with any camera, and can be incorporated effortlessly into any pre-existing workflow. Check out cleverghost.net for more. Lens choice is one of the most meaningful options we have as image makers. It determines the overall look of your visuals, and that's why I've spent a fortune on lenses and the least amount on cameras. Investing in premium glass will remarkably provide greater returns for image quality enthusiasts than any incremental camera upgrade. After this contentious question that I've raised on focal length, you've likely been wondering this whole time, why not use a zoom lens and be done with it? Well, if you've ever felt paralyzed by choice, you might come to the understanding that an abundance of choice is not actually a choice at all. It's a redundancy, and it robs your decisions from carrying any creative weight. With abundantly accessible filmmaking resources at our disposal these days, there's no excuse for why we shouldn't be able to reach higher than practical convenience. That's my main gripe, though you'll also have a harder time finding economically comparable zooms that are visually on par with primes. For me, a zoom needs to have 5 to 10x range for their differentiating slow zoom capabilities. Otherwise, why not just use a prime? Each project calls for a different look, and which lens is right for you is like asking what kind of singer you want for your band. Depends on what kind of music you want to make. And would you rather have a versatile singer that can cover a range of songs, or a specialist with a unique voice? As an enjoyer of image fidelity, I prefer the size, performance, and choice that primes present. Their inflexibility also promotes an artistic resolve, forcing you to commit and understand all their limitations. Cinematographers are more habitual than we care to admit. It's not that intuitive to use a 28 for a close-up or a 55 for a wide shot. And yet, By not having the luxury of a flexible zoom, you may finally be able to resort to these unorthodox frames by repositioning the camera instead. Filmmaking, reduced to its essence, is choice, often thousands of micro decisions per project. While battling imposter syndrome and creative insecurities, we constantly second-guess ourselves. But it's these decisions, good or bad, that distinguishes each storyteller. As we all stumble uphill in pursuing greatness, you might find that the only choice is the one that's wholeheartedly, unapologetically yours.